At approximately 6:30 in the evening on the 23rd of June, 1942, a German fighter pilot crossed a channel and landed at an airfield. He waggled his wings as he crossed the field boundary, the victory roll of a man who has just shot down an enemy and wants everyone on the ground to know about it. He lowered his undercarriage with the ease of a pilot who knows exactly where he is and exactly where he is going. He taxied smoothly to the dispersal area, exactly as he had done hundreds of times before at his home base in Brittany. He opened his canopy. He looked at the men waiting for him on the ground. They were wearing blue uniforms. They were speaking English, and one of them was pointing a flare gun directly at his face. After the excitement of taking part in an aerial battle and finding what he thought was a safe spot to land, it reportedly took Faber a moment to notice that those greeting him were not fellow Nazi officers in familiar uniforms, but men dressed in blue and talking in a completely different language. Oberleutnant Armin Faber had not landed in France. He had landed in Wales, and in doing so, he had handed the Royal Air Force the most valuable intelligence gift it would receive in the entire air war over Britain, the only intact Focke-Wulf Fw-190 fighter ever captured by the Allies during the war. To understand the magnitude of what Armin Faber inadvertently delivered to RAF Pembrey on that June evening, you need to understand what the Focke-Wulf Fw-190 had done to British air power in the 12 months before his arrival. At the start of the war, the RAF had held a genuine technological edge in fighter-to-fighter combat. The Supermarine Spitfire, elegant, fast, highly maneuverable, had proven itself in the Battle of Britain in 1940 against the Messerschmitt Bf-109, Germany's primary fighter. The balance between the two aircraft was close, and German fighter pilots respected the Spitfire. But the balance existed. RAF pilots flew with confidence in their aircraft's capabilities. Then, in August 1941, the Focke-Wulf Fw-190 made its operational debut in France. The Fw-190 quickly proved lethal to the Allied pilots who encountered it, and was able to outperform the Spitfire at low to medium altitudes. Except for turn radius, the new German fighter was superior in just about every way to the RAF's main frontline fighter at the time, the Spitfire Mk. The implications were immediate and serious. RAF Fighter Command's tactics, its training, its pilots' instinctive understanding of what their aircraft could and could not do in a dogfight, all of this had been built around the assumption that the Spitfire was competitive with anything Germany could field. That assumption was now wrong, and pilots were dying because of it. The Fw-190 seized aerial superiority from the RAF for nearly a year, until the introduction of the vastly improved Spitfire Mk9 in July 1942 restored parity. That year was, for RAF Fighter Command, one of the most anxious and frustrating periods of the entire war. Pilots knew they were flying into combat in an aircraft that the enemy's frontline fighter could outperform. They adapted their tactics, staying at higher altitude where the Fw-190's radial engine was less efficient, avoiding the low and medium altitude engagements where the German fighter was most dominant. But adaptation without information was incomplete. What they needed desperately was the aircraft itself, an Fw-190 that they could take apart, measure, fly, and study until they understood exactly what made it work. The British desire to get their hands on an intact Fw-190 had, by mid-1942, generated a series of increasingly inventive and increasingly desperate plans. The British schemed to steal a Focke-Wulf 190, but worried the plans were unlikely to work. One such scheme included sending a German-speaking RAF pilot in a Luftwaffe uniform and a captured Messerschmitt fighter into France to land at an Fw-190 aerodrome, let off a stream of German, demand a new aircraft, and take off in an Fw-190. This plan, which would have required, among other things, A German-speaking British pilot willing to land a captured Messerschmitt at an active Luftwaffe airfield in occupied France, perform a convincing impersonation of a Luftwaffe officer, and successfully demand and receive a brand new FW-190 was, it is fair to say, optimistic. It was not implemented. The Germans were aware of British interest in their new fighter. Aware of that, the Luftwaffe prohibited its FW-190 pilots from flying over Britain, lest one get shot down and give the British the opportunity to inspect the wreckage. Then, one of the biggest oops moments by a WW-2 pilot delivered an FW-190 in pristine condition straight into the RAF's hands. Adding to the irony of his embarrassment, Faber had only recently delivered written orders from Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring prohibiting FW-190 pilots from crossing the English Channel. The man who had personally carried Göring's orders forbidding exactly this kind of incident was about to create exactly this kind of incident. Oberleutnant Armin Faber was, by June 1942, a 24-year-old administrative officer, Gruppenadjutant, for the 3rd Fighter Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader II, based at Morlaix in Brittany. His role was performing administrative and personnel paperwork duties, as well as flight duties. He was not, primarily, a frontline combat pilot. He was a capable officer who flew operationally, but whose main job was paperwork. On June 23rd, his squadron was scrambled to intercept RAF bombers attacking their home base. Faber asked for and received special permission to fly a combat mission with the 7th Staffel, a frontline unit flying the FW-190. The FW-190 had only recently arrived with frontline units at this time, and its superior performance had caused the Allies so many problems that they were considering mounting a commando raid on a French airfield to capture one for evaluation. What followed was a complex and violent air battle over the English Channel. The Focke-Wulf 190s had the better of the engagement. In the subsequent dogfight that developed over the English Channel, 7 Spitfires were shot down, compared to only 2 Focke-Wulf 190s. One Czechoslovakian Spitfire pilot, Alois Vashotko, dramatically lost his life when, in the fray of combat, he collided head-on with an FW-190. In the confusion of the fight, Faber found a Spitfire on his tail. He flew north, deeper into British airspace, away from France, to shake it off. He succeeded. He managed to turn on and shoot down the pursuing Spitfire, piloted by Sergeant František Traitner. Traitner bailed out safely, although he had a shrapnel wound in his arm and sustained a broken leg on landing. His Spitfire crashed near the village of Black Dog, Devon. Now, Faber was alone, low on fuel, disoriented from the dogfight. He had flown north to escape the Spitfire, then north again through the confusion of combat. He looked down at the water below him. The disoriented Faber now mistook the Bristol Channel for the English Channel and flew north instead of south. Thinking South Wales was France, he turned towards the nearest airfield, RAF Pembrey. The Bristol Channel and the English Channel are not, to a pilot who knows the area, easily confused. They run at different angles, the land on their respective shores looks different. But Faber did not know the area. His fuel was running low, and the psychology of a pilot who knows he is nearly home, who knows France is somewhere beneath him, had overridden the navigational evidence his eyes were providing. He was over South Wales. He thought he was over Brittany. He turned towards RAF Pembrey. RAF Pembrey in Carmarthenshire, South Wales, was a training station. It was not a frontline fighter base. The duty pilot on the evening of June 23, 1942, was Sergeant Jeffries, a training airfield duty pilot, whose job on a normal evening was paperwork and routine. Observers on the ground could not believe their eyes as Faber waggled his wings in a victory celebration, lowered the Focke-Wulf's undercarriage, and landed. The wing waggle was not just a celebration. In the context of what Faber believed he was doing, returning victorious to his home base in France after shooting down a British Spitfire, it was the natural, uncomplicated gesture of a man who had had a good day and wanted his colleagues to know it. The men watching from the ground at Pembrey saw a Focke-Wulf 190 performing a victory roll over a Welsh training airfield and then calmly landing. Sergeant Jeffries identified the aircraft as German while it was still on final approach. He had, as the duty pilot at a training station, no weapon other than a standard-issue flare gun. He made do with what he had. The Pembrey duty pilot, Sergeant Jeffries, identified the aircraft as German while it was landing, and he ordered his men to signal it to park in the dispersal area. As the FW-190 slowed, he jumped onto its wing and took Faber prisoner with a flare gun. The image of this moment, a sergeant with a flare gun jumping onto the wing of Germany's most advanced fighter aircraft as it taxied to a stop on a Welsh training airfield, taking its pilot prisoner, is one of the more absurdly improbable scenes of the entire war, and it happened exactly as described. After the excitement of taking part in an aerial battle and finding what he thought was a safe spot to land, it reportedly took Faber a moment to notice that those greeting him were not fellow Nazi officers in familiar uniforms, but men dressed in blue and talking in a completely different language. As the gravity of the mistake slowly dawned on him, the stricken Faber was so despondent that he attempted suicide, unsuccessfully. The man who had personally delivered Göring's orders forbidding FW-190 pilots from flying over Britain had just landed his intact FW-190 on a British airfield, waggled his wings at the RAF, and been taken prisoner by a man with a flare gun. What happened immediately after the landing was, if anything, even more improbable than the landing itself. Faber was later driven to RAF Fairwood Common for interrogation, under the escort of Group Captain David Atcherley. Atcherley, fearful of an escape attempt, aimed his revolver at Faber for the entire journey. At one point, the car hit a pothole, causing the weapon to fire. The shot only narrowly missed Faber. Armin Faber had navigated his way to the wrong country, landed at the wrong airfield, been taken prisoner by a man with a flare gun, attempted suicide, and was now being driven at gunpoint by an escort officer who nearly shot him by accident when the car hit a bump. He survived all of it. He was sent to a prisoner of war camp in Canada. He attempted to escape, unsuccessfully. He was repatriated just before the end of the war due to ill health. The war, for Armin Faber, had ended. In every practical sense, the moment he performed that victory roll over South Wales. While Faber was beginning his journey into captivity, his aircraft was beginning a different kind of journey, one that would ultimately prove far more consequential for the outcome of the air war over Britain. The FW-190A3, work number 313, was an extraordinary prize. It was not a crashed or battle-damaged aircraft that needed reconstruction. It was not a wreck that could only be studied in pieces. It was the only FW-190 fighter to be captured intact by the Allies during the war. All other captured FW-190s were either of the long-range bomber or fighter-bomber types. The RAF moved with impressive speed. At Farnborough, the FW-190 was repainted in RAF colors and given the RAF serial number MP499 and a P for prototype. Testing and evaluation commenced on 3 July 1942 at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, RAE, at RAF Farnborough. Roughly 9 flying hours were recorded, providing the Allies with extremely valuable intelligence. The FW-190 was first delivered to the Royal Aircraft Establishment Facility in Farnborough, where it was meticulously reassembled for initial test flights in July 1942. Once airworthy again, the FW-190's speed, agility, and handling were carefully recorded by test pilots. The FW-190 was then presented to the Air Fighting Development Unit at RAF Duxford, where it was studied by British aeronautical engineers and RAF pilots. It was put through comparative speed and simulated combat tests with other fighter aircraft. After 10 days, it was transferred to the Air Fighting Development Unit at RAF Duxford for tactical assessment, where it was flown in mock combat trials against the new Spitfire Mk, providing the RAF with methods to best fight the Fw-190A with their new fighter. What the testing revealed was precisely the information RAF Fighter Command needed. The Fw-190's performance envelope was mapped in detail: its top speed, its climb rate, its turn characteristics at different altitudes and airspeeds. Its strengths were confirmed. So were its weaknesses. The Fw-190s became relatively sluggish at higher altitudes. This knowledge aided the Allied forces and saved countless lives as the aerial battles turned increasingly in their favor. The altitude weakness was the key. RAF pilots had already been tactically avoiding low-altitude combat with the Fw-190, but now they understood precisely why this was the right approach, and exactly at what altitudes the balance shifted. The information did not revolutionize RAF tactics overnight, but it gave pilots and planners a data-grounded understanding of the aircraft they were fighting that no intelligence report, no interviews with captured pilots, no analysis of combat camera footage could have provided as precisely as 10 days of test flying the aircraft itself. The introduction of the Spitfire Mk in July 1942, almost exactly simultaneous with the Farnborough evaluation of Faber's Fw-190, was not a coincidence, though the timeline was close enough to generate historical debate about the exact causal relationship. The Fw-190 seized aerial superiority from the RAF for nearly a year, until the introduction of the vastly improved Spitfire Mk in July 1942 restored parity. The Mk had been under development before Faber's landing, driven by the operational experience of the preceding 11 months against the Fw-190 in combat. But the detailed evaluation of Faber's aircraft provided RAF engineers and tacticians with a precise technical picture of exactly what the Spitfire Mk needed to match, and confirmed, once the new variant began flying against MP-49 in mock combat at Duxford, that parity had indeed been restored. The mock combat trials at Duxford were, in their own way, as extraordinary as Faber's landing itself. Two of the best fighter aircraft of the Second World War, on opposing sides, flown by RAF test pilots against each other in simulated combat over an English airfield. The enemy aircraft in British colors, being used to sharpen the tactics that would be used against it in the real air war continuing 100 miles south over the Channel. The Fw-190 was then transferred to number 1426 Enemy Aircraft Flight. The Fw-190 was flown 29 times between 3 July 1942 and 29 January 1943. It was then partially dismantled, and tests were carried out on its engine's performance at Farnborough. It was struck off charge on 18 September 1943 and scrapped. The aircraft that had been the most feared fighter in the European air war was scrapped as surplus to requirements in September 1943. By then, the RAF had already learned everything it needed. The deepest irony in the entire story of Armin Faber's navigation error is the one that has been preserved in the historical record in several independent sources, and that requires a moment of pause to appreciate fully. Faber had only recently delivered written orders from Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring prohibiting Fw-190 pilots from crossing the English Channel. This was not incidental. Faber's administrative role, as group and adjutant, he handled paperwork and personnel matters, including the delivery of orders from higher command. He had, in his capacity as administrative officer, physically carried the document that told every Fw-190 pilot in his unit, do not fly over Britain. Do not risk giving the RAF an intact example of this aircraft. He had delivered those orders. He had read those orders. He knew those orders existed. And on June 23, 1942, disoriented in a dogfight over the Channel, low on fuel, flying north when he thought he was flying south, He violated those orders in the most comprehensive and irreversible way possible. The man who delivered Göring's warning handed the RAF Göring's worst nightmare. The story of Armin Faber's navigation error is, in the grand scale of the Second World War, a small story. No battles were won by it directly, no campaigns were decided by it alone. The air war over Britain and Western Europe was determined by thousands of factors: production numbers, training quality, strategic decisions, technological development, the sheer weight of Allied industrial capacity. But within those thousands of factors, the specific intelligence gift that Faber delivered to RAF Pembrey on June 23, 1942, has a documented and identifiable place. The evaluation of MP499 at Farnborough and Duxford gave RAF Fighter Command a precise, technically grounded understanding of the aircraft it was fighting. The mock combat trials gave test pilots and tacticians a direct, hands-on sense of the FW-190's handling that no written report could replicate. The knowledge that FW-190s became relatively sluggish at higher altitudes aided the Allied forces and saved countless lives as the aerial battles turned increasingly in their favor. One navigation error. One man confused about which channel he had crossed. One victory roll performed over the wrong country in front of the wrong audience at the wrong airfield. It is one of the most consequential mistakes any pilot made in the entire war. And it was made not by incompetence exactly, but by the specific, mundane human failure of a tired pilot who was sure he was somewhere he wasn't, in a landscape he didn't know well enough to read correctly. Armin Faber spent the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp in Canada. His aircraft was flown 29 times by RAF test pilots, transferred to the enemy aircraft flight, and scrapped in September 1943. One of them ended up in a comfortable prison camp learning English. The other ended up providing the data that helped win the air war over Britain. History has a particular sense of humor about which one left the more lasting mark.